Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 9th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. Today, we are joined by Professor Richard Salsman. Before I even get into introducing Professor Salsman, I just wanted to remind everyone who's joining us on Zoom to ask us questions there in the little Q&A icon, or if you're on Facebook, welcome. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Just type your questions right on into the comment section, and we will get to as many as we can. But we are going to keep it to about an hour. So again, welcome. Dr. Richard Salsman is a lecturing fellow of political science at Duke University. He's also a senior fellow at AIER. He published Golden Liberty in, last year, and his work is featured in Perspectives on Ayn Rand's Contributions to Economics and Business Thought. Welcome, Professor Salsman.
Very good to be here. Thank you, Jennifer.
So I was intrigued by a lecture that you recently hosted in an online class that you have for students, your markets and morals, which I've been grateful to be able to sort of audit some of those. And in particular, a couple of weeks back, you did one on a very provocative topic, I thought. It was policing for good or ill, defend or defund,
Right.
and it was quite the lively discussion. So before we even kind of get into the reading materials and some of the topics that that you covered and that we'll cover today, let's maybe just take a step back and talk about, from a philosophical point of view, why this is such a hot topic, not just because of recent violence, because of Black Lives Matter, but because of the very fundamental issue of racism. How do you regard it? How should one regard it from a philosophical and indeed an objectivist point of view?
Well, philosophically, I could go at this, I think, philosophically, and some of that session, if you recall, was also empirically. So that's important too, just to ground your arguments in facts. But I would say philosophically, the way I look at this is policing is a fundamental government function. And if capitalism is the system of individual rights, such that government's sole function is to protect those rights, the typical functions, this is as opposed to the purpose of government. So we distinguish the purpose of government is to protect individual rights. Now, how do they actually do that? How do they carry it out? The functions standardly have been military defense, courts, and police. So the first thing is just to situate this whole thing in the context of, is this something government should be doing, before we get to the issue of how well are they doing it or how badly are they doing it. And I thought I would bring this up with the students. And by the way, this isn't through Duke. This is kind of like offline summer stuff. I do these sessions called Morals and Markets for students. And so their interest in it is really interesting to me, because there's no credit for it. There's no obligation that they take it. Now, whether government does these things well or ill, well, we know they don't always judicially or militarily, on police, always do the right thing. And I would argue that when you expand the size and scope and power of government beyond those three functions, you not only start violating rights, you don't even do those three things very well. So, in other words, you divert attention, money, effort, energy to other things, associated normally with the welfare state. And to the extent the welfare state is generating citizens who are either ill-informed, illiterate, innumerate, uncivil, it is not going to help, even if government does focus on the police. They're going to be overwhelmed, especially by particular groups who are treated that way. So in many ways, I think the idea of defunding the police, while on the surface to advocates of limited government might be shocking, in a way, philosophically, I think it's good, because it's so extreme. It's so fundamental a claim that it's a good time to bring up what the point of policing is, and to go from there, and to certainly look at why it might be done badly. I've made the point elsewhere that in the realm of government failure, what I call government failure, because we're so used to thinking of market failure, you know, and then government comes in and fixes market failure. If government is supposed to do these three things, we can see failures all over the place. Like 9/11 could be seen as a failure of national defense. They were supposed to provide national defense and they didn't, right? What was the reaction to that, though? Not to defund the Pentagon. The reaction, for good or ill, was to upfund and create a whole new Department of Homeland Security, if you recall, and in many cases, like, violate civil liberties with the Patriot Act and all that we see through the TSA. And even in the financial crisis of 10 years ago, you could have concluded that the problem with that was a massive government failure of artificially promoting home ownership. I mean, that's what Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and others were doing, right? And instead of concluding that and saying, well, that's what ruined the financial system, they also upfunded those, so that they certainly preserved them and spended mass amounts of money. So it is odd that in this case, if there's a failure, and I think it was really minor, not to diminish too much the loss of life, but here it's the complete opposite reaction. Notice the reaction here, again, granted, it's a small fraction of the reaction, is to defund the police, not to say, wow, there's a problem with policing. Maybe they're not getting enough training. Maybe there's not enough police out there anticipating criminal activity. So maybe we should upfund it and make sure the monies are spent well. It's a very odd dynamic in that regard. So that's how I look at it philosophically, and we can talk about the empirics of it. But the empirics of it, which I've studied in the last month or two, I'm no expert, by the way, on criminology or on the stats, but it isn't difficult to get your hands on it. And the numbers are just overwhelming, that the quality of policing in the US is very good. It's not systemically racist. And you could look at it very different ways, you know, as a percent of the population, what are certain minority groups? And then as a percentage of, say, robberies or homicides or interactions with the police. And adjusted for those things, there is actually less violence and brutality meted out against blacks and other minorities than against whites. And looking the other way in terms of violence against police, the numbers are overwhelming that way as well. Namely, police are something like 18 or 19 times more likely to be harmed by these minorities than the other way around. So we can talk about those. I don't want to go on too long, but that's the basic way I look at it, philosophically and empirically.
Yes, well, and then also philosophically, we have a perspective on the issue of racism itself. And Ayn Rand has talked about racism as the lowest, most crudely primitive form
Right.
of collectivism.
Right.
Share with us a little bit of your perspective on that.
Well, that's a famous, at least within the Ayn Rand readers, a famous 1964 essay written right around the time of the peak of the civil rights movement, the Martin Luther King speech, the Civil Rights Act. Yes, she said racism is a form of collectivism. And what is collectivism? Not looking at the individual, but rather the group they're in. And the reason she thought racism was like the worst possible form, and also almost like a crude, what she used to call, I think, is a barnyard form of collectivism, to look only at skin color and race and ethnicity and things like that. I mean, you can group people all different ways, right? You can say scientists or policemen or businessmen. And even then, you can make mistakes like saying, you know, all policemen are racist or all businessmen are cheats. You know, and you wouldn't want to do that. But the problem with racism, she said, is not only is it a form of collectivism, which she was very much against, she also said in that essay, very interestingly, she said it's also a form of determinism. So now this is a little more technical term. And determinism in psychology is the idea that you are not the author of your own life. You don't have free will. You're literally determined by your ancestry, and you're either taking credit for things that aren't yours just because they're in your ancestry, or feeling guilty. That can go that way too. You can feel guilty for what ancestors did. But she said this is just an injustice, really, to yourself and others, to lump yourself into a group and then say you either have vices or virtues just dependent on that group. She said, no, it's what you do with your own life and the choices you make. She didn't use the word victimhood, but that essay also has a lot in there that go to that concept, I think, where she's very much of the view that she should be self-reliant and independent and not be looking for others to rectify even past injustices, especially if they didn't commit them against you. So those are just some of the things that are in there. She talks about things like reverse racism. She does touch upon reparations even. So it's a fascinating essay, but she said something like this. She said, you know, you're going to get more racism in a world where collectivism is growing. So this is obviously a form of it, right? And she said the antidote to that is individualism. The antidote to that is, she actually said, color blindness. Now, you know, if you say you're colorblind today, the critics will say, well, that ipso facto makes you a racist. You know, how can you deny that you see color? And so even the ideal of saying, listen, we need to judge people on the content of their character, on their actions, on their statements, not on the color of their skin. The fact that that alone is being resisted, this is the Martin Luther King type view, right? That is very troubling to me. But it's an essay well worth reading. I think it's just titled Racism. I don't even think it's on racism, but it's racism. And I think it's in the Virtue of Selfishness.
Yes, yes, it is. Well, getting back to more of the looking at some of the statistics, and you know, granted that this is not your sphere, but you have been studying it, and you've chosen two readings,
right,
where they are written by people that is their field and that is their area of study,
right,
including Heather McDonald's piece
right,
in the Wall Street Journal, "The Myth of Systemic Police Racism,"
right.
and then also the piece in the New York Times, "Cities Ask If It's Time to Defund the Police and Reimagine Public Safety."
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about why you chose those two readings and what some of the key takeaways are for you.
Well, these are, you know, I try in these seminars I run for students not to load them down with 30-page, you know, academic journal pieces, although those do exist and back up these more popular pieces. I thought I would pick the Heather McDonald piece and then the other one in the New York Times. The New York Times piece is more of a kind of an impression of what the general view seems to be, which is anti-police right now. Heather McDonald has been studying this for years, and I think her book is actually called The War on Police or The War on Cops. So she's definitely a specialist in this. She's been studying it for many years. If you want to read another account that's on the Heather McDonald side, John Lott, L-O-T-T, has not only written a lot on guns and gun violence and school shootings and things like that, but also the relationship between policing and crime. And I think one of his prior books is something like More Police, Less Crime. So if you just invert that and say, wow, if we're going to move toward less police, we're going to get more crime. And is this something the defunders know, or they don't know and they're advocating it anyway? It's important to know that. The Heather McDonald piece called The Myth of Systemic Police Racism, she does cite many deeper academic studies. One of the most interesting coming from Roland Fryer, who's an economist at Harvard, and he went and dug through the data looking for, and the data sometimes actually isn't very good. This might surprise you. The data isn't really collected in some cases in a pristine way. Anyway, he got his hands on the data he could, starting with interactions between the police and citizens, and then started categorizing it by race and things like that. And he's the one who first shocked the world, probably 2016, 17 or so, by issuing a study saying, I don't find any systematic racism by cops. And I don't think it's really relevant that he's black, but that's one of the reasons it shocked the New York Times, Washington Post, and other people, because you know, they see everything in terms of race. So they would be like particularly impressed, I suppose, if a black person discovered this. I don't really look at it this way. I think any scholar can find the facts. But so that's the Heather McDonald piece. You know, if you generally want an argument for, it's not merely an argument for, but an analysis of, is there actually systemic racism, and can I read someone, you know, who's going to do an op-ed but give me further studies to read, you know, without having to read them myself. I can go check her references and see whether that's what I did. Actually, I went and checked and started reading these 30-page academic papers about the studies, and what she said is true. There is no evidence of it. Jennifer, I think philosophically, it might be interesting just to think about I don't know how I describe this other than the visceral, concrete, human, I mean, it's definitely human reaction to seeing, as we all did, horrific videos of brutality. And how that occupies our mind versus dry background 30-page academic studies, you know what I'm saying? And so I'm actually sympathetic to the problem of people saying, don't tell me about all these studies. I can see with my own eyes that this is terrible, brutal, and inhumane. And I agree with that, but there's a real danger in jumping from that to all cops are fill in the blank. I mean, that is just basic, fallacious, hasty generalization, you know, and it's a kind of stereotyping that we're warned not to do with every other group in the world, which is true. You know, we shouldn't do that. All businessmen are cheats, all women are bad drivers. I mean, whatever kind of silly things we've heard over the years, you know, and you wouldn't want to do the same thing with cops. It's the same error to do it that way.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so, and I hear you on that. And also we want to hear from you, people that are watching and that are participating in this, this exciting webinar. So please ask us your question on the Zoom platform or send us a message over Facebook, and I'd like to get to your questions. So Professor Salsman, you know, you talk about like what we see and our visceral takeaway from that. But one of the things that I see and that I have a visceral takeaway from is seeing the violence and the deaths, what's happened in Chicago, what's been happening in some of these areas where there is either a police pullback, or that's official, or that is not official. And then historically, of course, there's the famous example of the Montreal police strike on October 8th, 1969, where the police were striking for just a totally different kind of work-related, we want better benefits, and what happened over the course of that. So could you speak to that? What are some of the consequences of a potential Ferguson effect, or, you know, in this case, a Floyd effect of police pulling back, and how do we think about that?
That's a good question. I think one of the vicious circles you can get into is spreading what is really a myth, that there's systemic racism. But now imagine you're in a minority class and maybe you're younger and you're living in the inner cities and you're going to have, say, more interactions with the police. If your mind is pre-stocked with that myth, you're going to resent the cops more, you're going to resist arrest, all the things that contribute to some of the violent endings that occur. And that's really tragic. It's really a shame. And by the way, the statistics show that as well, that you can break down the statistics to, you know, is there shooting or violence with an interaction leading to a fatality in the case where there's no resistance to arrest? The numbers are almost zero. In other words, there's no cases where a policeman just goes up to someone and berates them for a bit and then brutalizes them. But if you, as we saw in the case of Atlanta in the Wendy's parking lot, if you engage with a suspect even for 20 or 25 minutes, as those police did, and then the suspects resist arrest, you know, the police are kind of stuck with, well, what do we do now? We need to restrain the person, but then you restrain the person, then they grab your weapon. Okay, well, now what do we do now? Just walk away as he has our weapon, then you go and chase him, but then he puts the weapon on you. If the advice was that there is not systematic racism, but that you should try not to break the law, but then even if you're pulled over having not broken the law, and maybe you are pulled over for racist reasons, that's terrible, right? But even then, it's inadvisable to resist arrest. If you think you've been unduly accosted or arrested, you know, bring it up when you get down to the station. I have also heard, by the way, that body cams on police, we would think that the body cams are making the police behave better. The studies have shown that it actually makes the suspects behave better. So the suspects becoming more aware that they're being filmed, they don't act up as much. And so these are rare cases where you see resistance to arrest in front of the cameras. So that's another thing. Here's another thing I worry about in terms of vicious circle. There is evidence that the police are so berated and so maligned that they themselves are losing morale. That they themselves are saying, what is the point? What is it? It's not worth it. If I go in and try to enforce the law, it's all downside for me. I'm either going to be on film somewhere, or I'm going to be sued, or I'm going to be fired, or I'm going to lose my pension, you know. So some of them, I think, are silently shrugging, as Ayn Rand would put it, backing off. There's a phenomenon called the blue flu, where they don't quite quit outright, probably because they don't want to lose their pensions, but they just don't show up to work because they're sick. So they say they're sick, they have the flu. And that's happening in many cities right now. And the crime rates are skyrocketing to some degree because of that. And so I worry about that, because if the police are not only defunded, but not defended, and if they're derided, and suppose you don't want to be a policeman, the pool of possible policemen to pick from, the quality has to go down. This phenomenon has already been seen, right? So suppose the original criteria was you can't be a cop, if you have a record, So like when the pool was big and clean, so to speak, you say, well, okay, we're not going to definitely train a cop who's had a record. But if you can't get enough cops, you start lowering the bar. You say, well, okay, you can have a record, but only if it's nonviolent crime, but you could see that if this keeps going down, 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 and they're lowering the bar, so to speak, for hiring and training, the quality of the police is going to go down, and this is going to get worse, right? I don't think it's all that bad now, but it's going to get worse because the quality of the police themselves will go down. So.
Yeah. Well, okay, and I wanted to remind people to send us your questions for Professor Salsman, and we'll try to get to a few of them. We have one that came in, which is off the topic of defunding or defending the police. It is from Vicky, she's actually asking about funding, but for a different of a different variety. She was asking about there's been a lot of funding and loans, PPP loans for businesses that have been prevented by lockdown policies for in transacting their business.
Right.
She's saying she knows the Atlas Society didn't accept any of that funding. I guess for Professor Salsman, do you have a perspective on that in terms of businesses or nonprofits that don't pay taxes taking government bailout money?
Yeah, I think it's very wrong to take bailout money. I think it's especially wrong for those whose mission, who's declared a distinct mission, is to be pro-capitalist, for lack of a better description, or be pro-liberty. And certainly for groups that have spent years advocating for more limited government, lighter taxes, less spending, deregulation, to participate in this huge bailout, to me, is just very wrong, and it's actually unjust, and it's a lack of integrity, I think. Now, some have argued that, well, government policy is actually harming us. Now, I don't deny that especially in the case of COVID-19, to me, it's not the virus that wrecked the economy. It's the government policy response to the virus. You probably agree with this, Jennifer, but the forced business shutdowns and the compulsory stay-at-home orders and the wearing a mask and other things, that has definitely damaged businesses. And I can see why some businesses might say, listen, I need restitution. But I think a distinction, and I think you've made it, you should talk on this maybe more than me, a distinction between a nonprofit who isn't paying taxes already, but then on top of that is basically receiving donor contributions. It's not like they're open for business every day with the sales front, trying to develop sales, but they're in the middle of CHOP, and the local anarchists won't let anyone shop in your store. That is a very different situation than some of these foundations. So I am very troubled by it, but I also think it's a good opportunity to distinguish and differentiate your product and say, listen, not only are we advocating the right ideas, we're living them. We really mean it. And we're not just doing this opportunistically. We've said this in a principled way. So I know you've made other points, and I totally agree with them on issues like maybe subsidiary, secondary issues like strings attached. I mean, there are always strings attached when you take money from the government and you lose your independence. I think they even have a requirement, right, that if you take some money, you can't let people go or reduce their hours or things like that. So, but more than that, I think it just damages the reputation, especially of those who've been advocating for less government involvement. You can't be seen as a victim. Many of them aren't actually victims, and so that's the kind of distinction I make. I have seen what your society has done, and I really kudos to you guys for standing up on principle and not taking bailout money.
Well, thank you. One of the things that, we've both been in this sphere of trying to spread objectivist ideas for a long time, and there are you much longer than I have. I've been in the private sector mostly, but that one of the hits on Ayn Rand is, well, she was on the government, dole, and so that is one of the sort of myths that you always hear. And I think that it's important to distinguish between someone who pays taxes into a particular program. In her case, she paid Social Security taxes into Social Security. And so then she should not take the benefits that she already paid for. To me, that would be sort of an injustice. But also to distinguish between those in our donor community who had businesses who were directly harmed by a particular government policy, prevented from doing their business. So
your donors would be more directly affected and victimized, say, than you might, and so it indirectly hurt you. Absolutely. Yes, the issue of when they would say, well, Ayn Rand's a hypocrite because she took Social Security. You're absolutely right, Jennifer. She was never on the dole in the sense of taking unemployment money. And I wouldn't even call Social Security a dole to the extent that you pay in taxes. In fact, in the early 80s, they started referring to those as, if you remember this, they started calling them entitlement programs. And I had a problem with that, I remember initially, because I didn't think it was right to feel you were entitled to be supported by the state. But then I realized some people were using it, the Reagan people actually were using it, because they wanted to distinguish actually between cases where you paid in and you were basically due the money back at least, right? And Social Security itself actually doesn't pay back to you anything close to what you contributed to it, at least for certain subgroups or so. So that's a totally false charge against her for that reason. But she's also being cited for an essay about scholarships. So, if your parents are less wealthy than they would be otherwise, and therefore say can't afford to send you to college, it came up, I forget when she wrote this, but it came up, well, is it okay to get a government guaranteed loan or a scholarship to get to college? Is that kind of a way to get restitution for taxes paid? And in some cases she said yes, but I think none of that justifies, certainly in today's context, that would be used to justify taking bailout money amid the COVID thing, to me is outlandish, actually.
Well, particularly, I think now, one of the things that was remarkable to me coming back into the nonprofit education sphere, the idea sphere, the think tank community, over 4 years ago, having been out of it, for 20 years, having been in the private sector at a time when there was so much spectacular disruption in how we educate and how we communicate and how we persuade, so that it just brought the costs way down, and opened up just way new markets for how you can communicate. And we do that a lot at the Atlas Society on social media, on platforms like this. So I can understand that if you had a business or even a nonprofit like Meals on Wheels or whatever, you can't do you're being
Yeah.
prevented from doing this. But in
Yeah.
this day and age, when technology makes it really exponentially easier, and it getting more interesting, day by day, to be able to transact and persuade people. I
I
mean,
mean, would you agree, Jennifer, that there's also incentive effects? Say a donor looking at your organization, some other organizations, they have options, right? And on the one hand, and they're doing this because they like the ideas being advanced by these foundations. They would look and they say, "Oh, you're taking government money? Okay, why should I give you money? Apparently, you're getting money from the taxpayers. And on top of that, I'm not happy with you because you don't seem to be exercising the values that are important to me." Of course, this can happen all over the spectrum, right? There can be others, like suppose, I don't know, the Pentagon sends out checks to some, left-wing group, and their donors say, "Oh my God, are you taking Pentagon money? I'm disappointed with you, and this is terrible." But I think it also takes away the focus of what's to be done to fix the loss of funds.
mm-hmm.
Right. So if you say, okay, we're not going to reopen the economy, we're going to keep it closed and keep printing money and borrowing money and sending people checks, or making them reliant on us and creating a dependency culture, it takes away the pressure to change the underlying policy, right, which is actually bankrupting us. I often think to myself, as this continues, I think if you were to just not know the details of what happened in 2020, if you did not know starting at January 1 that there would be anything called COVID, or that there would be riots in the streets or tearing down statues, right? But I said to you, there's going to be a Great Depression, and nobody will have access to income. And then government will start issuing checks for so long and so repeatedly that you basically have a government guaranteed income. No one would believe it. They would think, what, Ocasio-Cortez is now president and we've implemented socialism overnight? And yet in steps, that's exactly what's happening. And there are people like Sanders and others who are saying, well, since we're writing checks, why don't we just implement a guaranteed government income for everybody permanently? So that, and I think there's also a kind of interest on the left in seeing what it's like to live under the Green New Deal. Now, you don't hear much about the Green New Deal anymore, right? But if you remember when it was introduced last year, it had features like we shouldn't really be flying on planes. We really shouldn't be, doing this or that, or eating burgers or this. And when you see today that the airports are empty and, the schools are empty, it's almost as if this is the plan for the Green New Deal, but it's in the form of COVID. By the way, schools, I think people should really keep an eye in the coming weeks, really, on schools. If the schools remain closed, so will the economy. I'm really worried about this. I said to people about a month ago when they said, what do you think is going to happen? One of the things we did discuss is I said, it's really important to reopen the schools in September. It's really late August, right? That's when they open. Because the connection between your kids at school and your freedom to do your job it's really inextricably linked. And I really worry that a delay in returning children and university students to school, but mostly secondary and younger kids, is going to completely continue to tank the economy. So the idea that there'll just be a decline and then a V-shaped recovery, there can't really be a V-shaped recovery if the kids don't go back to school. And this sounds kind of pedestrian, but that's I think the logic of it, actually.
Okay, we have a question here from Kate Jones, and she's bringing us back into sort of philosophic territory. And Kate asks, why do people tend to want to join groups or mobs of shared conditions rather than have each individual remain independent? Clans, kin, clubs, tribes. So it's sort of a long question, but I think you get the gist. What dynamic accounts for this? How can we prevent hostilities from arising between separate and differing collectives? So I think it's a little bit about sort of tribalism. Where does it come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have to always start an answer like this by saying, some groups are benevolent. The idea that individualism is atomism is not true. It's a common mistake. I'm not saying you're making the mistake, but when we make the case for individualism, we shouldn't deny that, you know, certain groups associate with one another for perfectly good reasons and purposes. They could be a cause, but even a business, when you think about it, is a grouping. A social club is a grouping. A book reading group is a grouping. I think what you're getting at is, what about bad groups? What about people who join groups for nefarious reasons, destructive reasons, the kind of reasons we see on television? I think these people really totally lack self-esteem. They really do. You could say they're ignorant, and there's some of that as well, but they're very insecure and they lack independence. And then the root, if you know objectivism, the root of this is they really don't trust their minds. That's as basic and philosophic as I can get. If our mind is a source of survival, as Ayn Rand argued, if it's the source of both living and thriving, and if then you weaken that, however it's weakened, if you have teachers telling you your mind is impotent to know reality, or if you have teachers telling you, you know, if you learn too much, you're going to outperform other kids and you should feel guilty about that. Whatever it is that severs or weakens or erodes the power of the mind is going to make, especially young kids who are making their way in the world, it's going to make them very insecure. I mean, it would almost be like, suppose you're thrown into a jungle and you're a civilized person, actually, right? But with no weapons, no food, no nothing. I think they actually have reality shows that do this. But of course, there's a camera crew behind them and a whole catering group. But I'm saying really thrown in. That is and you would be terrified. You would think, I'm not going to survive. I can't craft a weapon, you know, overnight and start defending myself. That's how I feel. That's how I try to introspect and think. That's what these mobs and violent people must feel like. I think that they feel like, I don't have my tool at hand. They don't maybe not even know what the tool is, but they're not good at thinking. They're not good at thinking independently. What gives them a kind of pseudo self-esteem? Being in a group. Being in a group that's saying the same things, chanting the same things, doing the same things, burning the same buildings. That's the best answer I can give to you. I think it verges so much on psychology, which is also not my field. I couldn't give you a full answer to it, but I think it's rooted in the philosophy that says your mind is impotent. And if that's true, you can't really get on in reality, and you can't even judge people as to which groups you should join or not.
Well, and I want to get to the question of your beginnings in objectivism, and we'll do that in a little bit. But first, we've got a great question here from Phil Coates. Great to see you. Where is the battle of over the police likely to end up in the next year or two? There will be changes, either bad or good. Will some of the reform measures work, such as police no longer being immune from prosecution, or will they be walking off their jobs? Will they be not enforcing the law because they're afraid of being sued or of a protester?
If you're looking for a year ahead forecast, and of course this includes the election, so maybe that will skew this a little bit. My own prediction is somewhat pessimistic. I'm hoping for a kind of backlash, would not be the word, but a return to sanity where citizens rise up and say, defund the police? What are you talking about? We're for law and order. This is disproportionately, the defunding and the de-escalation of police presence is disproportionately harming those lives you claim matter so much. But all lives were going to be affected by this terribly. I think it's a very bad trend. I think in a year from now, it'll be worse than it is now. Now, will the violence be as bad? I don't know, but I think there'll be fewer police. There'll be less funding for police. The crime rates will go up. And the problem I mentioned earlier of recruiting will get worse. It'll be harder to recruit, and the quality of police will go down. I just think it's a very negative trend, and I think it's going to persist for a while. As to the election, ironically, I actually think if Trump lost, that conditions might improve, not because Biden and others wouldn't want to defund the police. They're on record saying it. And Trump is on record saying, you know, I defend the police and we're not going to defund them and I'm for law and order and all that. But there is such an animus against Trump. There is such an irrational Trump derangement syndrome going at it that I actually think if the Democrats got in, they would not want to give trouble to the incumbent Democrat president. And all of a sudden things would be solved and all of a sudden things would be clearing up and all of a sudden the press coverage would say, well, I think things are, wow, it looks like things are improving. Trump's not here anymore. So that's just a weird, like paradoxical outcome that could occur. But I don't see, do you? I don't see anyone, Heather McDonald and others are exceptions, advocating for more funding for the police. And if reforms are needed in terms of stopping or minimizing brutality, that's not the direction this is going. Was it New York that got rid of 600 plainclothes policemen? I mean, the plainclothes ones go out and just mingle among the population trying to preempt crime and bring in the necessary research. That's gone. And those kind of things, people aren't really aware of what they do. They only see the men in blue or the women in blue. Those kind of things will enormously undermine law enforcement. And the third thing I think is I don't see anything in there of the kind I mentioned earlier, any kind of movement toward telling young kids not to fight with cops. If anything, the direction's the other way. Namely, I have a right to fight with cops now because I'm told they're all racists. By all, I mean that's what systematic means, or systemic, right? Sometimes you hear the word structural, institutional, systemic, all those words. Be very careful on the lookout for those words because it's saying all of them are, and the system makes them be so. That is a very dangerous, it's not only wrong, but it's just a very lethal idea to send out there, especially to young kids who are more likely to come in contact with police. Now, if they don't, by the way, if they don't come in contact with the police, as Jennifer mentioned, citing some of the Chicago statistics, if they don't come in contact with the police because the police are withdrawing or being defunded, it's not like they're not going to come in contact with each other. They will. They will. And the violence level between people with no cops around will intensify. And that's terrible. It's terrible. It's a massive loss of life. By the way, in that presentation, Jennifer, I don't know if you remember this, but I just went back and looked because the discussion is defunding. So I just went and looked at the funding. I thought, well, I wonder what the numbers actually are. And it wasn't difficult to get the numbers. The Federal Reserve issues the numbers. So, you know, most policing and schooling and things like that is done at the state and local level, not federal, right? So you can look at FBI numbers if you want it. But I just went to the database for spending by state and local governments in the US last 50 years. And the categories were law enforcement. They actually have a category called law enforcement. You can look it up at the Fed St. Louis. And the subsidiary accounts are police, courts, and prisons. All right. So I collected that data and charted it. And then the other two I picked up were spending on public schools, spending on healthcare, and spending on social welfare services, right? So if you know, the ones who are advocating defunding are also simultaneously saying, divert that money over to schools, healthcare, welfare services, right? Well, I don't have it I actually do have it in front of me. Maybe you can see this. So here's the chart. If you look, the line that's going up the most is public schools. And the two lines below it, healthcare and social services. The three little lines down below are law enforcement. My theme is they've already been defunded. I mean, I don't mean funding isn't going up for law enforcement. I mean, relative to these other spending categories, police funding is in the basement here. So it's a completely different take, of course, on what's happening. And maybe the conclusion could be that there's not enough funding for the police. But actually, I think the problem is the top line. Top line is public schools. Right? It's not the spending per se, but what I'm saying is if in those schools anti-law and order ideas are being taught, then that is the real problem. That there's massive funding of teachers potentially teaching kids the wrong idea about what capitalism is all about, what America is all about, what the police are all about, what racism is all about. And if that's the case, we're looking at the wrong number. You know, it's not take the lowest number and lower it further. It's let's really investigate this top number and what is that money being spent on? Because it could be, I think, largely being spent on things that exacerbate the problem instead of ameliorating it.
Well, Neil Lohman asks, he wants a copy of that of the
Okay.
funding data, and we will get it to
Yes,
you.
I'll be glad to send you that. Yes.
Really something it was kind of shocking. But you know, it also speaks to, as you're talking about that top line where it's just going through the roof, and that is funding for the public schools.
Yeah.
Cited earlier, you know, that there are terrible consequences in terms of families being able to function and work in terms of the schools remaining closed. But at the same time, I mean, if there is a silver lining to this, is that that's where it starts. This is where the source is. Where kids are being indoctrinated with identity politics and a social justice agenda and the church of global warming, and that is what's happening in the schools, and that just has consequences. So I do think it'll be interesting as kids are not necessarily receiving that indoctrination, and maybe they're going on to Khan Academy, or they're being homeschooled and they're going to different options where we might see a halt of the spread of a different kind of virus per se.
One of the ways I describe it is, and I notice, here's another way to differentiate the product, so to speak, who's more capitalist or not. Conservatives really aren't very good at this. So you notice the conservatives are very good about saying, wow, the schools are terrible, and the schools are indoctrinating our kids, and the schools are this, and the schools are that. And I listen and I say, true, 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 true. Now, what are you doing? Their goal is, you know, they'll say something like, try to get on the school board or try to influence the textbooks. Notice what they're missing. This is public ownership of the means of instruction, which sounds like public ownership of the means of production, but it's the public ownership of the means of instruction of teachers, right? So the schools are owned and controlled by government, but that's socialism. I mean, socialism by definition is public ownership of the means of production and control, of course, right? Whereas capitalism is private ownership of the means of production. But that would include, capitalism has to include private ownership and control of the means of instruction, of the schools, of the, and you know, that's no guarantee that the teaching will be good. But we all know that if the schools are predominantly socialist institutions, they're either going to be promoting socialist ideas or socialist, you know, pay structures, or as you see, these teachers who are not held accountable for bad teaching. I mean, that is just a standard socialist story, right? That socialist regimes basically ultimately falter and crumble precisely because they punish the able and the intelligent and bail out the opposite. So I don't think there's a fundamental enough critique of the schools. They need to be heavily privatized. I know charter schools are something, but even charter schools are public schools. I think they're really just public schools with special carve-outs or something. But even there's an objection to having charter schools, right? So if people are looking for a more fundamental solution, I wouldn't go so far as to say defund public schools instead of defunding the cops, but I'm almost there. I want the funding diverted away from public schools toward private schools. And it's not really difficult to do. This is not rocket science. It's not like, you know, coming up with a vaccine for COVID-19. There are many plans on the table from free market economists over the years to privatize education, and it just hasn't taken hold. And maybe the American people finally would see and say, wow, now we're seeing the fruits, the bitter fruits of years and decades of bad public schools, but I still think they don't know what to do about it. They still don't know where to send their kids, especially if you try to send your kids to a private school and you're paying for the public schools anyway. It's impossible. You're being double. You're paying double,
We've
and you're
got a
still.
couple
And
of,
you're, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, we've got a couple because we only have about about 10 more minutes. Some great questions. Let's see, Jim Byrne and Arthur Holst asking, what does the university system need to do to help educate students on liberty? Also Jim saying, one could say the root cause of this issue is hijacking of the American educational system. How do we counter that? And like John Galt and producers did in Atlas Shrugged, do we abandon those municipalities and watch them fall into decay? So this is your field. You're an educator,
Yeah, it's a big
college
question.
professor.
It's a big question. I'm in no position, being in a wonderful job at Duke and teaching.
Yes, just call for defunding
I
of.
like I'm in no position to be saying, surrender the universities or give up the universities or critique the universities for some good things they could be doing. They are doing it in some form. So there's often been a bias anti-university because it has a particular content that it's pushing, especially in the social sciences. But my view has always been, if you're really interested in the world of ideas, if you're really interested in the life of the mind, so to speak, study, go get a good degree, develop a good topic, and go teach. That is the best way to do it, but slinging arrows from outside inward isn't going to help. I must say, when I'm being in academia, the thing I most try to emphasize, which I think is fair enough to all sides, is two things. Diversity, that's something everybody wants, right? But I stress intellectual and ideological diversity. I don't want to be a racist. I don't want to be a genderist. I want to be focusing on a variety of opinions in intellectual matters. And secondly, objectivity. Now, this is really crucial. And it's under assault. But if you say to a student, listen, here's the syllabus, here's the material, here's what we're going to learn this semester, I implore you to be objective. And they'll say, what do you mean? I'll say, I implore you not to just resort to your feelings or other things or what your peer pressure groups are saying. Try to be as objective as possible in learning about this stuff and judging it for yourself. And that goes a long way, I think, toward improving the universities. You can't, as an individual, improve an entire university, but you can reach a lot of students by those two points: diversity, objectivity. If you have students who don't want to do that, they're really not students. They're nearly not serious.
Yeah, another thing I would say is, I mean, there's what's going on in the university and what we can do within that context
Yeah.
to promote these kinds of messages. But in terms of what, what kinds of content kids are actually consuming,
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the things that to me was amazing, that from the days that when I was at Harvard to now, that, the books are just do not have the same place that they held in education 20 years ago. The graphic novel sections of libraries and universities and bookstores have exploded. So that's why at the Atlas Society, we have our graphic novel, the Anthem graphic novel. We're coming out with our second graphic novel. We take all of these, we animate them. We look at what kids are consuming in terms of content, and we create content that they want, like our Draw My Life series, where they are getting the messages, but it's in a fun, kind of dramatic way. So I mean, if you want to support, kids getting that kind of message and alternate messaging, then I'd say, support the work of the Atlas Society, support what Professor Salsman is doing.
It's also noticeable that that attention spans and time horizons have shrunk.
Yes.
And I don't know entirely what this is due to, but the idea of recommending to a student, read this 350-page book and let me know what you think about it. People don't do that anymore, and that's troubling, especially if that's the only way you're going to get a sustained argument about something, right? So they're getting it in sound bites. I hate to say even bumper sticker approaches, and That's why you get the chanting and stuff like that in groups. It's very concrete bound, almost gnat-like, and that's a problem to face students and try to expand their, not just their awareness of different ideas, but just to, prolonged study of something without the distractions of social media and PDAs and things like that. That's a real challenge. But if I say too much of this, Jennifer, I'm going to sound like an old man complaining about, the good old days when we used to read physical
Yeah.
books.
Well, but things are what they are,
Yeah,
and Ayn Rand
right.
had the famous analogy of crash landing onto,
Yeah,
a planet and looking around. And so, I mean, if one was educated in a time where people were reading 300, 400-page books, and now they find themselves in this time, that's
yeah,
kind of the perspective that we take at the Atlas Society, which is how are, the kids, what are they consuming, and can we
yeah,
give them, even
yeah,
if it is a sort of an abbreviated,
right.
more funny way to give the
Yes.
content, and then hand them over,
No, I
to
think
Professor Salsman.
I think
Or
that's
to,
I think that's the right approach. So you go at them like, you look out and say, well, how are you actually learning now? And if it's just something like, well, I just scan it on my phone, you're like, oh, okay, let's start with scanning on your phone, and then whittle down the students who, no, give me more answers. You got a deeper answer than
yes,
that? Can we sit and
yeah,
talk about it? Can we go? They'll pretty soon it'll whittle down to, but there will be a group of really serious students and
yeah,
adults. It's not just students,
no.
and they'll be very intelligent and very powerful. And I've met them; they do exist.
And that
Um,
is one of the things that Professor Stephen Hicks in the waterfall program that we
yeah,
have at the Atlas Society website, where there is a much deeper dive,
yes,
so that
yes,
that we can go from, wow, that was a cool video, that was a cool
right, yeah,
meme or whatever, and then you have a link to a deeper dive. And of course, we have the Atlas Advocates and the Atlas Intellectuals, which people
yeah,
can join. So we're about to wrap up. So speaking of Atlas,
yeah.
and who is John Galt, I've been, I like, when I'm eating, I save the very best thing for
Oh, yeah,
last. So
okay, yeah,
don't
good.
like take my plate away too soon. So this was the question that I wanted to ask Professor Salsman and get to sort of his origin story, if you will, within objectivism, and his journey, and how he first heard about Ayn Rand, and what brought him to where he is today.
Well, I don't think I've ever quite heard it put that way, an origin story, but I like it. Okay, so this is 40 years ago. So 40 years ago, I was 19, 20 years old. Okay, so now I'm in my parents' basement bored, and my father collected books. And my father was conservative, so when I was raised, this was outside of Boston, I had a kind of environment where business was respected, but they were also Catholic and religious. And anyway, so dining room table discussion I got was, America's a good country generally, and what's wrong with Nixon and Carter and Ford? Those are the presidents of the time, to show you how old I am. Okay, but I see a book called Capitalism. And I pulled the book out, and literally I thought I was reading about, I don't know why I was interested in this at the time. I thought I was going to read a book about how factories work. That is how narrow my focus was. I thought, that's what I thought capitalism was. Now I'll read this book, and I'm just curious about how factories and the economic system work. And when I opened it up and it said, I think the opening line is something like, this is not a treatise on economics. This is a book of essays about the moral case for capitalism. And I thought, what? I couldn't believe it. What I used to say at the dinner table when the riots were going on in the 1968 and the 70s and stuff like that, my father would say one of two things. People are rotten, or they're miseducated, or they're not religious enough. So can you imagine, halfway through Capitalism and the Unknown Ideal, it says, what's the chapter called? Conservatism and Obituary. So that was a real eye-opener too. Not only am I reading this book, but I'm reading an argument for why conservatives are not good at defending capitalism. And it was an answer that I guess I kind of had been asking my father for years. Like, if your arguments are so good, why is there anti-capitalism in the streets? I used to actually say to him, I'd come back from church and I'd say, that sermon was just denouncing rich people and denouncing money making. And isn't that what you do? I mean, he wasn't rich, but he was a businessman, and he just had no answers. So that's my origin story. There's a long history after that, but I immediately just started reading everything. But that was the opening, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal.
That's
I
interesting
was
because
in school.
there are some there. You are in the minority. I at least I kind of feel anecdotally in terms of people that
Oh,
first sort
yeah,
of got her nonfiction
yeah,
and then went on to
right.
read the fiction. So well, we'll have to have that conversation, and I want to hear the rest of your history within objectivism. I know we have a couple of trustees, including Jay LaPere. Hey Jay, is watching, who's been following your work for many
Oh,
years,
nice.
and
Okay,
so
great,
yeah,
great,
so I'd love to maybe get you on one of our happy hours that we have with our trustees and some of
great.
our top donors. And I want to remind everybody we're going to have our next the Atlas Society Asks with our senior scholar, Professor Stephen Hicks, and also Marion Tupy next week. So please sign up for that. Ask your questions early so that we can get to all of them. And thank you, all of you, for joining us. And thanks to those of you who have supported the Atlas Society and believed in what we're doing and supported our decision not to take bailout money, and makes it possible for me and for Professor Salsman to talk to you in this kind of format. So we really appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.
Can I just
Thank
say,
you.
Jennifer, quickly, thank you
Yeah.
so much for inviting me. Thank you for the Atlas Society and all its donors. I really had fun. I appreciate it. Hope we do more work together in the future. This is great.